Don't embarrass me. My husband's voice was barely above a whisper, but somehow it cut through the polished conversations, echoing beneath the grand chandeliers of the White House East Wing. We had just cleared the first security checkpoint. Uniformed Marines stood at attention. Military aides moved with quiet precision. Guests in evening gowns and decorated dress uniforms filled the marble hallway. Everything smelled of polished wood, fresh flowers, and old American history. Ethan adjusted the medals on his Army service uniform and glanced at me without smiling. "Just stay close," he muttered. "Smile when you're supposed to. Tonight is important." I looked at him but said nothing. He mistook my silence for obedience. We stepped toward the check-in desk where a young hostess greeted us with practiced warmth. "Good evening. May I see your invitations, please?" Ethan immediately produced his envelope with a flourish. "There you go." His confidence practically filled the room. The hostess scanned his QR code. A pleasant beep. "Welcome, Colonel Harper." "Thank you." He slipped the invitation back into his pocket before looking at me. His lips curled into the same smirk I'd grown painfully familiar with over the past 3 years. "Well," he asked quietly. I reached into my handbag. Instead of pulling out the invitation he'd watched arrive in our mailbox days earlier, I removed another envelope, one he had never seen. The White House seal shimmered beneath the crystal lights. His eyebrows narrowed. "What is that?" I didn't answer. I simply handed it to the hostess. She smiled politely. "Thank you, ma'am." She scanned the QR code. The scanner beeped. Then, nothing. Her smile disappeared. She stared at the screen. Her eyes widened. She checked it again. Then a third time. Without another word, she slowly looked past me toward the senior naval officer standing several feet away. A 4-star admiral who had been greeting distinguished guests all evening. "Sir," her voice trembled. "She's here." The admiral turned immediately. His expression changed the instant he saw me. He walked over with surprising speed. Every nearby conversation seemed to fade. Ethan looked from me to the admiral, utterly confused. The admiral stopped directly in front of me. "Colonel Rachel Harper," he said, warmly extending his hand. "We've been looking forward to seeing you." Around us. People stopped talking. My husband blinked. "What?" I met the admiral's eyes. "It's an honor to finally meet in person, Admiral." "The honor is ours," he smiled. "The president will be pleased you've arrived." Beside me, Ethan's face had gone completely pale. I could almost hear the questions racing through his mind. "The president." "Looking forward to seeing her." "Why?" Before he could ask a single one, everything changed. Because this story didn't begin at the White House. It began almost a year earlier, back when I still believed humility could save a marriage, back when I thought love was stronger than pride. My name is Rachel Harper. I'm 29 years old. For nearly a decade, I served as an Army logistics officer. If you've never worked in military logistics, it's easy to underestimate what we do. Most people picture paperwork, spreadsheets, supply rooms, clipboards. Even Ethan used to joke that I was the queen of inventory. I'd smile every time, not because it was funny, because correcting him would have required explaining projects I wasn't allowed to discuss. Operational security wasn't optional. It was my oath. While combat commanders often became the face of successful missions, people like me worked quietly behind the scenes. Fuel, medical supplies, aircraft routing, emergency transportation, strategic contingency planning. When everything worked, nobody noticed. When something failed, everyone did. I actually preferred it that way. Recognition had never motivated me. My father had spent 32 years in the Army. He taught me something I'd never forgotten. The best officers, he'd say, don't chase applause, they chase responsibility. I tried to live by that lesson every day, even after I married Ethan. When we first met at Fort Liberty, he wasn't like the man standing beside me at the White House. He laughed easily, thanked enlisted soldiers by name, stayed late to help junior officers. He admired people because of their character, not their rank. That's the man I fell in love with. But promotions can change people. Not always. But sometimes, each new assignment made Ethan a little more concerned with appearances. Every new medal became another conversation starter. Every promotion made him slightly less interested in anyone else's accomplishments, especially mine. At first it happened in little ways. At neighborhood barbecues, someone would ask what I did. Before I could answer, Ethan would grin. "Oh, Rachel keeps everything organized." People would laugh. "So she's the organized one." I'd smile politely. Something like that. Later, during holiday dinners, my mother-in-law loved introducing Ethan. "My son is one of the Army's brightest officers. Then she'd gesture toward me. And Rachel works somewhere with logistics, as though my career were an afterthought. No one meant real harm. At least that's what I kept telling myself. Over time, Ethan stopped asking about my work altogether. He assumed every late night meant paperwork. Every classified phone call meant scheduling. Every unexpected trip meant another conference. He never imagined that some of those weeks determined whether thousands of American service members would receive critical support overseas. I couldn't tell him. Not because I didn't trust him. Because I had signed documents promising I wouldn't. So I carried two burdens. The responsibility of my mission, and the loneliness of succeeding where even my husband couldn't know who I truly was. I convinced myself marriage required sacrifice, compromise, patience. What I didn't realize was that silence sometimes teaches people they can keep underestimating you, and eventually, they start believing it. The White House invitation would prove exactly how wrong my husband had been. Looking back now, I can pinpoint the exact moment our marriage started drifting apart. It wasn't because Ethan stopped loving me. It was because he slowly fell in love with something else. Status. The Army teaches leaders to wear rank with humility. Some people remember that lesson. Others only remember the rank. When Ethan pinned on Lieutenant Colonel, I was happier than anyone. We'd spent years moving from base to base, living in temporary housing, postponing vacations, missing birthdays, and celebrating anniversaries over video calls. His promotion felt like our victory. At least I thought it did. The first few weeks were wonderful. He was proud, confident, grateful. Then something changed. He started introducing himself by rank before introducing himself by name. Every conversation somehow circled back to his command. If neighbors asked about our weekend, he'd find a way to mention an inspection he'd passed. If family asked about work, he'd spend 20 minutes describing leadership challenges before casually waving toward me. Rachel keeps busy with logistics. That sentence became his favorite description of my career. Not Army logistics, not strategic logistics, just logistics. One evening we attended a retirement dinner for a brigadier general outside Arlington. The ballroom was filled with officers, spouses, retired veterans, and Gold Star families. During cocktails, a retired Marine colonel asked me where I served. Before I could answer, Ethan laughed. Nothing exciting, she makes sure people get supplies. The colonel smiled politely. I spent 30 years in logistics support. He looked directly at me. That usually means you know where every skeleton is buried. I smiled. We try to prevent skeletons. He laughed loudly. Ethan didn't. On the drive home, he stared through the windshield. You didn't have to impress him. I blinked. I wasn't trying to. It sounded like you were correcting me. I answered his question. You know what I mean. No, I didn't. But I stopped arguing. That became my habit. Because every disagreement somehow ended with Ethan accusing me of being defensive, or overly sensitive, or competitive. Eventually, I learned silence required less energy. Unfortunately, silence can also become permission. Months passed. My responsibilities expanded. Without discussing details, my commanding officer informed me I'd been selected for a joint planning initiative involving multiple branches of the military: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, several civilian agencies. The work required additional security clearances, background investigations, long hours inside secure facilities where even personal phones weren't allowed. I signed another stack of non-disclosure agreements. What are you working on? Ethan asked one evening. I can't talk about it. He rolled his eyes. So, paperwork. I simply nodded. It hurt less than explaining why I couldn't explain. Sometimes he'd tease me in front of friends. If civilization collapses, Rachel will know where the paper clips are. Everyone laughed, including me. Not because it was funny, because correcting him would only raise questions I couldn't answer. One Saturday, my mother-in-law invited us for dinner. Family gatherings always followed the same pattern. Ethan sat beside his mother discussing promotions. His younger brother talked about real estate. Someone eventually turned toward me. What have you been doing lately? Before I opened my mouth, Ethan answered. The Army finally trusts her with bigger spreadsheets. The table chuckled. My mother-in-law smiled proudly at him. I'm just glad one of you has a career people understand. I looked down at my plate. My father had warned me years earlier. Never measure your worth by the loudest person in the room. I repeated those words silently, again and again. After dinner, my father-in-law quietly followed me onto the back porch. He handed me a cup of coffee. You know, he said softly, I've noticed something. I smiled. What's that? You never defend yourself. I don't see the point. He nodded slowly. My wife doesn't understand military careers. I know. But Ethan does. That sentence stayed with me all night. Because he was right. Ethan understood exactly how important logistics could be. He simply didn't believe my work was important. Several weeks later, I received a phone call from Washington. Not unusual. Except this time, the caller asked me to report to the Pentagon the following Monday. No details. Just instructions. Inside the secure conference room, representatives from multiple agencies waited. Maps covered the walls. Digital displays tracked overseas operations. Senior officers discussed supply routes, humanitarian aid contingency plans, and emergency evacuation scenarios. For the next several months, my life became a cycle of classified briefings and 18-hour workdays. Sometimes I left home before sunrise. Sometimes I returned after midnight. Ethan barely noticed. One evening, he looked up from his tablet. "You've been working late a lot." "I know." "Try not to burn yourself out." "I'll be okay." He kissed my forehead without asking another question. I actually appreciated that. Until a week later, we attended another military social event. Someone congratulated Ethan on his recent evaluation. Then they turned to me. "And how's work going, Colonel Harper?" Before I answered, Ethan laughed. "Oh, don't encourage her." The group smiled uncertainly. He continued. "If you ask Rachel, she'll convince you logistics runs the entire army." Everyone chuckled politely. I forced a smile. Inside, something cracked. Not because he'd embarrassed me, because he genuinely believed what he was saying. He had no idea that entire combat operations depended on people whose names never appeared in headlines. He had forgotten one of the oldest truths in military service. Victory belongs to everyone, not just the people standing in front. As autumn arrived, another envelope appeared in our mailbox. Heavy cream paper, embossed seal, official lettering. Ethan opened his first. His face lit up. The White House. He practically shouted the words. "We've been invited." He held the invitation like a winning lottery ticket. A military recognition ceremony. He immediately began making phone calls. His mother. His brother. 2 friends from command. Everyone heard the same sentence. "I've been invited to the White House." Not once did he notice a second envelope lying beneath his, addressed to me. Mine carried a different seal, different instructions, different arrival time, different protocol. I picked it up quietly. Read every line, folded it carefully, then slipped it into my desk drawer without saying a word. That night, Ethan was already planning what medals to wear, which photographs to take, who might be attending. He smiled across the dinner table. "This is probably the biggest night of my career." I looked at him for several seconds, then lowered my eyes. "No," I whispered to myself. "It isn't." He never heard me. And that was the last ordinary evening we would ever spend together. The White House had always seemed larger on television. Standing inside it was something else entirely. The polished marble floors reflected the glow of crystal chandeliers. Portraits of presidents lined the walls. Uniformed military aides moved with quiet efficiency, while members of the Marine Band played softly somewhere beyond the grand hallway. Everything about the evening spoke of tradition, honor, service, and sacrifice. Yet standing beside me, Ethan looked at the room as though it belonged to him. He straightened the ribbons on his Army service uniform one last time before giving me a sideways glance. "Remember," he whispered, "there are generals here." "I know." "And cabinet officials." "I know." He leaned a little closer. "This isn't the place to make small talk with everyone you meet." I nodded. "I understand." He smiled, satisfied that I had accepted another lesson. If only he had known. The hostess finished scanning his invitation first. "Welcome, Colonel Harper." He gave a confident nod. "Thank you." Then she reached for mine. I handed over the cream-colored envelope without saying a word. She scanned the QR code. Beep! For nearly 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then her expression changed. She looked down at the screen again. She blinked. Scanned it a second time. A third. I could almost hear Ethan's impatience beside me. "Is there a problem?" he asked. The hostess didn't answer him. Instead, she picked up the small radio clipped to her jacket. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Protocol, this is checkpoint 1. A brief pause. "I've confirmed her arrival." Another pause. "Yes, sir." She slowly lowered the radio before looking toward the entrance of the East Room. A 4-star admiral standing with several senior officers immediately excused himself from the conversation. He walked directly toward us. Not quickly. Purposefully. Every polished shoe striking the marble floor echoed through the lobby. Conversations around us gradually faded. Guests noticed. Even Secret Service agents shifted their attention. Ethan frowned. What exactly is going on? I remained silent. The Admiral stopped in front of me. His smile was genuine. Colonel Rachel Harper. He extended his hand. I'm Admiral James Whitmore. We've spoken several times by secure video conference. Yes, sir. It's good to finally meet in person. The honor is mine, Admiral. He shook my hand firmly. Then he surprised everyone, including Ethan. The Admiral stepped aside, almost respectfully. As requested, he said, everything is ready. Thank you, sir. He nodded. The President asked to be notified the moment you arrived. I heard Ethan inhale sharply. What? The Admiral finally looked at him. You must be Colonel Ethan Harper. Yes, sir. It's nice to meet you. The greeting lasted less than 2 seconds. Then his attention returned to me. If you'll come with me. A protocol officer appeared almost instantly. So sorry for the delay, Colonel. No problem. We'll escort you inside. Ethan instinctively took a step forward. The protocol officer smiled politely. I'm sorry, sir. Your seating assignment is this way. He pointed toward the general audience entrance. Ethan looked confused. My wife is with me. I'm aware. The officer remained professional. Colonel Harper has separate seating arrangements. Silence. Complete silence. I looked at Ethan for the first time since entering the building. He searched my face for an explanation. I offered none. There had been too many years of unanswered questions between us. This wasn't the moment to answer them. I quietly followed the Admiral. As we entered the East Room, I finally understood why every detail had been kept secret. Rows of chairs stretched across the room. Cabinet members, Joint Chiefs, members of Congress, families of fallen service members, recipients of military honors, representatives from humanitarian organizations. This wasn't simply another military reception. It was one of the most important recognition ceremonies of the year. The Admiral escorted me to the front section. Not the first row. The second, reserved for special guests. Several senior officers stood as I approached. A Navy Vice Admiral smiled warmly. It's good to finally put a face to the name. An Air Force general shook my hand. My staff speaks highly of you. The director of the Defense Logistics Agency laughed. I was beginning to think you weren't real. I smiled politely. Years of classified meetings had introduced us through secure screens. Very few had ever met face to face. Now they welcomed me like an old colleague. Across the room I spotted Ethan. His assigned seat was nearly 8 rows back. He hadn't sat down. He was still staring at me. His commanding general leaned over. Ethan. What? Do you know Colonel Harper personally? He answered automatically. She's my wife. The general raised an eyebrow. You never mentioned that. For perhaps the first time in our marriage. Ethan had no words. A military band announced the arrival of distinguished guests. Everyone stood. The President entered alongside the Secretary of Defense. Applause filled the room. After the national anthem, the President approached the podium. Good evening. More applause. Tonight we recognize Americans whose names rarely appear in newspapers. He paused. The men and women whose planning discipline and quiet professionalism have protected both American service members and innocent civilians around the world. I kept my eyes on the podium. My pulse remained steady. The President continued. Many of tonight's honorees worked under strict classification. Some couldn't tell their own families what they were doing. They accepted that burden willingly. Around the room, heads nodded. Military spouses understood. Veterans understood. Service often required silence. Then a photograph appeared on the large screen. Not of soldiers, not of combat. A satellite image. Supply routes. Medical evacuation corridors. Temporary humanitarian shelters. The President pointed toward the display. Last year, one coordinated logistics operation prevented what experts believed could have become one of the largest humanitarian disasters involving American personnel in recent history. Murmurs spread quietly through the audience. Most had never heard about the operation, because until tonight, it had remained classified. The President smiled. Planning that mission required extraordinary leadership across multiple agencies. He glanced toward the front rows, and one officer consistently refused individual recognition. My stomach tightened slightly. I knew what was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud felt different. The President looked directly toward my section. Colonel Rachel Harper. Across the room, Ethan slowly turned toward me. His face had become completely colorless. The President continued, Would you please join me on stage? At that moment, my husband finally realized the White House invitation had never been his story. It had always been mine. For a few seconds, I couldn't hear the applause. I saw people rising to their feet. I saw camera flashes. I saw the president smiling in my direction. But the only sound that truly reached me was my father's voice from years ago. The day people finally recognize your work, remember this: it isn't permission to become proud. It's a reminder to become even more humble. I stood slowly. The room erupted into another round of applause. The admiral waiting beside my chair offered a quiet smile. "You've earned this, Colonel." "I didn't do it alone." "I know," he replied. "That's exactly why you're standing up there." As I walked toward the stage, dozens of familiar faces nodded. Most of them had worked beside me for months, some for years. Very few of them had ever known what I looked like outside a secure video conference. One Air Force general whispered as I passed. "It's about time." I smiled. "Thank you, sir." The president met me halfway across the stage. He shook my hand firmly. "Colonel Harper." "Mr. President, the nation owes you its gratitude." "It owes my team, sir." He smiled wider. "That's exactly what everyone told me you'd say." The audience laughed softly. He motioned toward the podium. For obvious reasons, many operational details remain classified. He turned back toward the audience. "But I can tell you this. Last spring, intelligence suggested an Allied evacuation mission overseas could collapse within 72 hours. A large map appeared behind him. Colored lines stretched across several countries. Supply routes, medical corridors, airlift schedules, fuel depots, emergency staging areas." The president continued. "Military analysts estimated thousands of American service members, diplomatic personnel, and civilians could become stranded." The room fell completely silent. The solution required unprecedented cooperation between every military branch and multiple civilian agencies. He looked toward me. Colonel Rachel Harper coordinated that effort. Another wave of applause echoed through the East Room. "Because of that leadership," he paused. "Not a single American life was lost during the evacuation." This time the applause lasted nearly half a minute. I felt uncomfortable standing there alone, because every compliment belonged to hundreds of people. Transportation specialists, pilots, communications experts, nurses, mechanics, supply officers, young enlisted soldiers who loaded aircraft in the middle of the night. I accepted the framed Presidential Distinguished Civil Military Service Medal with both hands, then stepped toward the microphone. The room became quiet again. I wasn't expecting to speak, I admitted. A few people smiled. "But there's something I'd like to say." I looked across the audience. My father served in the Army for 32 years. He taught me that leadership isn't measured by how many people salute you. It's measured by how many people succeed because you quietly did your job. Several veterans nodded. I accept this recognition on behalf of countless military professionals whose names will never appear in headlines. I paused. The mechanics, the planners, the logisticians, the radio operators, the medics, the families waiting at home. They're the reason missions succeed. They're the reason people come home. The applause returned once more, longer this time. As I stepped away from the microphone, the president leaned over. "You just made my speech better." I laughed quietly. "I doubt that, sir." "I don't." He shook my hand again before moving to the next presentation. The ceremony continued for another hour. When it finally ended, guests gathered in adjoining reception rooms. Military bands played softly. Servers carried trays of coffee and desserts. Reporters waited behind designated ropes. The admiral found me first. "You've become very popular." "I'd rather disappear." He laughed. "I believe that." Several cabinet officials stopped to congratulate me. One senator thanked me for my service. A retired Navy captain told me his grandson wanted to become a logistics officer after hearing my remarks. Those conversations meant more to me than the medal. Then I saw Ethan. He stood alone near one of the tall windows overlooking the south lawn. The confidence he'd worn all evening had disappeared. When our eyes met, he walked toward me slowly. "Rachel..." I waited. I didn't know." "I know." "No." His voice cracked. "I really didn't know." "I know." He looked down at the floor. You thought logistics meant paperwork." He closed his eyes. "I was wrong." "You were." "I've embarrassed myself tonight." I shook my head gently. "No." He looked confused. "You embarrassed yourself long before tonight?" His shoulders sagged. "I never saw you." That sentence hurt more than everything else. Because it was true. Not cruel. Just true. I saw your rank, he whispered. I saw your job title. I never stopped to see you. Before I could answer, his commanding general approached. Ethan. Sir. The general looked from him to me, then sighed. I've known Colonel Harper's work for almost a year. Ethan stared. What? The operation she led saved careers. He corrected himself. No. It saved lives. He looked directly into Ethan's eyes, and somehow you never realized the remarkable officer you came home to every evening. The general wasn't angry. He sounded disappointed. That was somehow worse. After he walked away, Ethan remained silent. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, he asked the question he'd probably been asking himself since the check-in desk. Why didn't you tell me? I looked toward the White House windows before answering. Because I legally couldn't. He nodded. I understand that. I turned back to him. But even if I could have, I paused. I'm not sure you would have listened. His eyes filled with regret. For the first time since I'd met him, there was no rank, no medals, no confidence. Only a man forced to confront the difference between admiration and respect. And he was finally beginning to understand that one could never replace the other. People often think revenge is loud. They imagine shouting, slamming doors, public humiliation, making someone hurt as much as they hurt you. A year ago, I probably would have believed that too. But standing in the White House that evening, holding a medal I had never asked for, I realized something unexpected. The greatest revenge wasn't making Ethan feel small. It was finally seeing myself clearly. For years, I had measured my marriage by how much patience I could show. I believed endurance was the same thing as love. I kept telling myself that if I worked harder, if I stayed quieter, if I became even more understanding, eventually Ethan would see me. The truth was much simpler. People don't suddenly learn to value what they've spent years overlooking. Sometimes they have to lose it first. The reception slowly came to an end. Guests filtered toward the exits. Military aides escorted senior officials to waiting vehicles. The Marine Band packed away their instruments. Outside, the lights of Washington reflected against the wet pavement after a brief spring rain. I stood alone near the White House entrance for a moment, breathing in the cool night air. The city looked peaceful. Behind me, I heard footsteps. I was hoping you hadn't left yet. It was Ethan. His voice sounded different. Not confident. Not commanding. Just tired. I've been thinking, he said. I imagine you have. I owe you more than an apology. I looked at him quietly. I owe you years of respect I never gave you. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, he continued. When we met at Fort Liberty, I admired everything about you. You were smarter than me? I knew that. You were calmer than me. I knew that too. So what changed, I asked? He looked down at the sidewalk. I started chasing promotions. And somewhere along the way, I started believing my rank made me more important. He laughed bitterly. I spent years teaching young officers about servant leadership. I wasn't practicing it at home. That honesty mattered, because excuses can be rehearsed. Honesty usually cannot. I don't expect forgiveness tonight, he said. You shouldn't. I just wanted you to know. He swallowed hard. I'm ashamed of the husband I've been. I nodded once, then walked away. Not because I hated him, because healing doesn't happen in one conversation. It takes time. Real change always does. Over the following months, our lives moved in different directions. I accepted an assignment at the Army Logistics University in Virginia, helping mentor young officers preparing for leadership positions. It turned out I enjoyed teaching even more than planning operations. The students reminded me of myself years earlier. Curious, dedicated, sometimes uncertain. On the first day of every new class, I wrote the same sentence across the whiteboard. Leadership begins with respect. Then I'd ask them what they thought it meant. The answers were always different. Months later, Ethan requested a transfer out of his command. Not because anyone forced him, because he wanted to rebuild the kind of leader he had once been. He also enrolled in leadership counseling offered through the Army. A mutual friend told me something that stayed with me. He never talks about the White House ceremony. What does he talk about? The day he realized he stopped listening to the person who knew him best. That sounded more important than any punishment I could have imagined. One Saturday afternoon, nearly 8 months after the ceremony, I received a text message. Would you meet me? No expectations, just coffee? I stared at it for a long time. Then I replied, 1 hour. We met at a small cafe overlooking the Potomac River. No uniforms, no medals, no cameras. Just two people who had once promised to spend their lives together. He looked healthier, calmer, older somehow. Not in years. In wisdom. He didn't begin with an apology. He'd already done that. Instead, he asked about my students. I asked about his new unit. We laughed about our first apartment near Fort Liberty where the air conditioner barely worked and our kitchen table doubled as a desk. For the first time in years, the conversation felt equal. As we finished our coffee, he reached into his jacket pocket. I found this while cleaning my desk. He handed me a small photograph. It was taken the week we graduated from officer candidate school. We were standing side by side. Neither of us had medals. Neither of us had impressive assignments. We were simply smiling at the future. I miss those two people, he said quietly. So do I. He nodded. I don't know if we can ever become them again. I smiled gently. We shouldn't. He looked surprised. We're supposed to become better. That was the last thing I said before we walked outside. Whether our marriage ultimately survived isn't the most important part of this story. Some endings don't fit neatly into a single chapter. What matters is this. Ethan became a humbler officer. I became a stronger woman. And neither of us ever confused rank with worth again. If there's one lesson I hope you take from my story, it's this. Never underestimate the quiet person in the room. The people who seek the least attention are often carrying the greatest responsibility. Titles fade. Uniforms are eventually folded away. Medals gather dust. But character, that's what people remember. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of someone who served with quiet strength, I'd love for you to share it with someone who needs to hear its message. And if you enjoy stories about courage, dignity, and finding strength through life's hardest moments, I hope you'll subscribe and join me for the next one. Thank you for listening.